This is your Chapter 7 Cellular Respiration Notes. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Mitochondria are the organelles that release energy. They make ATP, which is stored in foods. Energy from carbohydrates. So where is that energy stored? It's mostly stored in carbohydrates, but it's also stored in all kinds of other molecules. We're going to discuss how the energy gets from carbohydrates into the form of ATP. So the Earth's atmosphere has changed over millions of years, and I brought up a couple of graphs here. A long time ago, we didn't know what the atmosphere was, and then eventually we've learned that the atmosphere had a lot of methane and ammonia in the upper atmosphere, and it had a lot of water in it and a lot of carbon dioxide. And it's mostly nitrogen, though, no matter how much atmosphere you look at, the majority of it is nitrogen. And then over time, when plants came to be, carbon dioxide decreased, and they created a bunch of oxygen that we can use now as animals. So animals couldn't even survive a long time ago before the plants generated enough oxygen for us to be around. So the Earth's atmosphere was so oxygen poor, so early releasing pathways were probably anaerobic, no oxygen. Even in plants originally, they probably had anaerobic pathways. Bacteria were anaerobic before the oxygen levels in the atmosphere increased. Anaerobic respiration will only yield 2 ATP per glucose molecule, so it's an inefficient way of making energy, but it does make some energy. Increasing oxygen levels led to evolution of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration produces energy from glucose, yielding 36 ATP, and this is the most efficient. So as the Earth began to fill with oxygen, so did the animal size begin to increase. The first eukaryotes were estimated to be around 3,000 million years old, but they got larger and larger and larger. First multicellular organisms were around 1,000 million years old. And the sharp increase in O2 that you saw in the previous graph allowed for larger organisms. And so when I say plants are creating these things, I'm talking about plants in the oceans and small plants on the surface of the earth, but mostly we're talking about plant-like protists that were making these increases in oxygen in the atmosphere. Because if you look at the age of millions of years, at the very end of that, you have a giant sequoia that's present. So even large trees weren't able to survive until the oxygen levels were enough to support their need for energy. So again, the oxygen levels had to be high enough to support aerobic respiration in those organisms. So you have to know a few equations for cellular respiration. The word equation for cellular respiration is food, sugar, or you could say glucose, plus oxygen, that A again represents an arrow, yields carbon dioxide plus water plus ATP, and that E stands for energy. Your chemical equation is C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus ATP, and again it's 36 to 38 ATP are made during that final stage. I have you a little mitochondria picture, a little diagram here, and before we get to that, I need to mention that ATP is a high energy compound. So here's my little mitochondria diagram. The main parts of the mitochondria, the cristae, are these folds in my mitochondria. The outer membrane is, of course, that outer orange area, that dark line that surrounds it. The inner membrane is the inside black line. It's what those folds are made of, those cristae is made of. That's the inner membrane. The intermembrane space is kind of like that darker yellow color in between the outer and the inner membrane. And then the matrix is that yellow inside of the mitochondria. I'd like you to label those if you would. Our next set of notes is going to talk about the process of aerobic respiration, and I want to get into that in the second video because it's going to take a while.